Education Committee. It is 1:30. Committee, we're going to jump right in to our approval of the minutes. I believe you should have been emailed the minutes for January 1st and then February 1st and all those dates. So with that, I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes. Representative Ruiz, seconded by Representative Getz. Discussion on the minutes. Good. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Motion passes. All right. With that, committee, we'll go ahead and open the hearing on House Bill 2223, the high-density sunset bill. With that, I will turn to your friend and mine, Revisor Jason Long, for a brief summary on this bill. Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. House Bill 2223 amends one statute in the School Finance Act, the Kansas School Equity Enhancement Act. This is 72-5151. The statute provides both for an at-risk student weighting for school districts and a high-density at-risk student weighting. The bill focuses on the high-density at-risk student weighting portion of that statute. This statute was originally enacted in 2017 with the Kansas School Equity Enhancement Act. It provides the high-density at-risk student weighting as an additional weighting for those districts with a high percentage of at-risk students in their enrollment. And by high percentage, the statute defines that as 35% and above. There are two separate calculations, one for districts with a enrollment percentage of between 35 and 50%, and one for districts that have an at-risk student enrollment of above 50%. The calculation of the weighting and the multiplier factors vary depending on which category you fall into. The statute also provides an alternative calculation. If your district doesn't reach 35% as a district on enrollment, you can look at individual schools within the district at their at-risk enrollment populations, and if anyone's school's enrollment population of at-risk students exceeds 35%, then you can perform those weighting calculations with respect to that school building and its enrollment and receive some high-density at-risk student weighting through that option. The statute was enacted in 2017, initially with a 2-year sunset, was going to expire in 2019. The following year, the provisions of the statute were amended, and they also extended the sunset by an additional year to 2020. And then in 2021, the statute was amended yet again, and the sunset was extended 3 years this time to 2024, where it stands currently today in the statute book. House Bill 2223 would quite simply just remove the sunset altogether. You can see that on page 2, line 25. So if this bill were to be enacted, then the high-density at-risk student weighting for school districts would continue year after year until at some point the legislature acted to amend the statute again. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Very good. Committee questions for the revisor. Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought it might have been in this bill, but could you explain to me the definition of a at-risk student, please?
Yes, an at-risk student is defined as one who is eligible to receive free and reduced priced meals through the National School Lunch Act.
And how is that determined? What is the qualifications to get that?
There is an application process for eligibility, and that's typically filled out by the student's parents regarding their household income, and if they qualify based on their income, then the student is considered an at-risk student. And clarify, for purposes of qualification for the weighting and school finance purposes, for purposes of students who receive at-risk education programs, those students are identified separately through identification for need for the actual at-risk student services.
Go ahead.
Thanks again, Mr. Chair. So based on that, we're making the assumption that an at-risk student, because their family is in poverty or low income kind of thing, that they are at risk of scholastically doing poorly because of that. Is that correct?
The low income status of the student acts as a proxy for funding purposes or determining the amount of funding that a school district is likely to need to provide at-risk educational services to students who need those. There's no assumption that just because a student is low income that they will need at-risk services for that any one student. It's simply a proxy for funding the at-risk education programs that the district provides.
Very good. Representative Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In this bill, we're just eliminating the sunset is what's happening here. Is that correct?
That's correct. There's no change to the calculation of the weighting or how the money is distributed to the school district. It's strictly just eliminating the sunset.
Okay, so is there any other sunset that this is subject to, or is this in perpetuity if we do this?
If you strike that line on page 2, then the weighting just continues essentially in perpetuity or until such time as the legislature were to change the law.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions of the committee? All right, with that, thank you, Jason. We appreciate that. We'll jump right into the proponent testimony. I'd like to welcome Bill Brady with Schools for Fair Funding. Welcome to our committee, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you for a few minutes, and I'll be brief because we've got some folks that know high-density at-risk funding much better than me behind me, and I want to give them as much time as possible. But this particular weight has been part of the formula since the LPA study was done at the legislature's request in 2004. And, you know, there's documentation of what the concerns were. Concerns of the study were that, you know, districts with very high levels of poverty, you know, have additional challenges. And so the weighting was placed in as part of that guidance from the legislature's own study. So it's been part of that. And then as we've gone through the court cases, at one point the legislature's response was a block grant, which basically froze all the funding for 2 years. And so that money was frozen like all the others. And then the court said that wasn't appropriate. And we weren't opposed. The court said the formula was in decent shape. It was basically the amount of money that the legislature and the governor were putting into it at that time. So that's what happened in 2017 is essentially the formula was reestablished, tailored a little bit differently. High-density at-risk was pretty much returned to what it was prior to 15, and we went on. As the committee worked the bill, the last thing they did, I was there at the time, was they sunsetted this one weighting. And the discussion, I'm not exactly sure why they did it. They did the long-term plan for funding, and they said we're going to do audits on these different weights. So they had an audit for high density, they had an audit for at-risk, they had an audit for transportation, they had an audit for ESL. And then, so let's sunset the first one, which was high density, and see where we are after we have the audit. Well, we had the audit. There weren't any significant changes that the audit produced, and the legislature didn't change the weighting the next year. And, but we couldn't get the audit, we couldn't get the sunset removed. We got it extended. And as Jason said, we've had it extended 2 times. So we're here, so why are we here today? We're here today because it's a challenge. It's very important. There's over 200 school districts that depend on this funding. And it's very important, and it's budgetary. It's a challenge because every year, right now we're looking at total funding through the fiscal year. You're working on 24, but if we don't extend it, we'd be looking at coming back in January and probably not having a decision until April, and the funding potentially going away July 1. So from a budgetary standpoint, you know, it's good to have for districts to have some ability to long-range plan. So that's why we're here today. If the sunset is the hang-up, we're open to ideas, and one idea would be to just extend it so that we have more than a year in advance so we can plan appropriately. I think you'll see from the testimony from these school districts that, you know, they've got a lot of things in place now, and they obviously want to continue those things to deal with their district's needs. Happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Very good. I think for time purposes, we'll just cruise through the proponents and then do questions at the end, if that's okay with everybody. Next, we have Kellen Adams, Superintendent, Chanute. Welcome, sir, to our committee.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Thomas and House Education Committee members. As mentioned, my name is Kellen Adams. I'm currently the Superintendent of Schools for USD 413 Chanute, which is located in Neosho County. Our district represents one of over 200 districts that receive some level of additional weighting under the provisions of the high density at risk. I'm speaking to you today in full support of the proposed changes to the current language contained in this bill. It is my belief that the proposed changes, including the removal of the sunset, provide numerous benefits that outweigh the current costs. The first point that I would like to address today speaks to combating the effects that living in poverty has upon the educational outcomes of a student. It is important to recognize that significant amounts of research have time and again provided clear results that a child's household family income will have a direct impact upon the potential trajectory of their educational pathway. And while it is acknowledged that some students are able to overcome these barriers without additional supports, many require these in order to have a true chance of success in that environment. Put simply, high density at risk weighting acknowledges this concept and seeks to provide the additional financial supports for these districts with high levels of students living in poverty. Generally speaking, students of poverty come from environments that provide less opportunities at home than their more affluent peers will experience. These additional supports run a wide spectrum, but can include any or all of the following: a lack of appropriate medical care, access to healthy food, appropriate and clean clothing, additional academic home supports, and home or family educational experiences. And while this list is certainly not meant to be exhaustive, each of these represents some type of barrier that a student of poverty is likely to experience given their family income. This in turn leads to a distinct disadvantage in the learning environment compared with their affluent peers. Additionally, I would like to address the concept of the cycle of poverty and the idea that there is significant research that supports that if and when a child is born into poverty and does not have a specific and targeted intervention to help him or her break that cycle, eventually that individual will invariably repeat that cycle as an adult and very likely with their own children. I trust that each member of this committee truly seeks to support the best interests of our students and wants to help them improve their lives and ultimately break from this cycle. A school district that is focused on these supports can ultimately become part of that change for a child's trajectory. As we should with any educational dollars, I think it's fair to evaluate how and where these resources are being directed. And while I do not offer to speak on behalf of all districts, it is fair to say that this information is readily available upon request from the district's local consolidated plan, should this committee desire more information. As a general concept, dollars expensed from high density at risk are targeted towards a specific intervention that is based upon the premise of supporting a known deficit. Simply put, each district and specifically each student has different challenges and subsequently different supports that are needed. And while supports will vary from district to district, they are grounded on the principle of using research-based structures that are known to have positive impacts. In the case of USD 413, this equates to approximately 130 students benefiting from summer school programming, 70 students reaping the benefits of after-school programming, 36 students currently enrolled in our alternative high school, 40 students receiving additional language supports, and 50 students able to enroll in credit recovery. While it's certainly not exhaustive, I believe that this list of appropriate expenditures speaks to the impact this funding can have upon our students that are most in need. Finally, I would like to speak to the attached fiscal note from Budget Director Adam Proffitt. As financial stewards for the taxpaying citizens of the state of Kansas, I truly believe it is always imperative that we evaluate the costs of any and all potential legislation and the impacts it will have upon our state. First, I believe it's important to note that the fiscal note of $76.8 million has been included within Governor Kelly's FY 2024 budget recommendation. However, I believe the more important factor here is that the removal of this sunset does not necessitate any new significant spending. Rather, the adjustments, if approved as recommended, would allow for the continuation of state general fund dollars that have been previously allocated. And while it is acknowledged that the total fiscal note is certainly insignificant in terms of the overall dollars, the critical point that this simply extends dollars already budgeted within the system should not be lost. It's on the contrary, however, that if this sunset were removed and the subsequent weighting were to expire, the effects for districts with high populations of students living in poverty would be extremely detrimental. While it is acknowledged that not all of the 200-plus districts receive a substantial amount of revenue, there are many districts that receive amounts that are significant enough to have a considerable impact. In the case of USD 413, that is estimated to be in excess of $500,000 next year. A failure to remove this sunset and allow for this funding mechanism to expire could truly be catastrophic for many districts within our state, forcing them into a spiral of ending programming and eliminating personnel that are currently providing direct supports for students of poverty. In summary, this bill, and specifically the removal of sunset on high density at risk, is good legislation that could be considered worthy of passage. While there has certainly been good discussion about the impact that they will have upon school districts, the reality, friends, is that this will ultimately impact the lives and potential trajectory of the students that need it most. I believe firmly in the power and ability of public schools to positively change the lives of children, and I wish to see them have the supports necessary to accomplish this. This bill and the removal of the sunset language certainly seeks to accomplish this wholeheartedly. Many thanks for your consideration of these remarks, as well as, more importantly, all that you do to support the citizens of Kansas. I will stand for any questions.
Thank you. And I know you got to take off soon. Does anybody have any questions for the superintendent? Representative Ruiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate you being here, taking time out to join this committee today. The guarantee of affluent students does not guarantee their affluent future. Is that kind of understanding what you said about students who are from a at-risk background aren't doomed to fail?
I would agree with that. I would say that the research certainly supports that your income will likely lead to that, but does not always. The same is said for their peers who are affluent. They sometimes will need additional supports as well.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions? Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I like the things that your school district's doing as far as extended school year and different things like that to try to reach out to these students. So my question would be, I guess, in order to break this cycle of poverty, do you have required classes at your school, for this, specifically for these students, free and reduced lunches that you're spending that money on? For example, like financial literacy classes or maybe parenting classes that is specifically those students have to take?
We have not required specific courses for students of poverty. Rather, we have gone to an intervention-based system in which we use data to determine what specific interventions are needed.
Further questions? Representative Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate some of the things you're saying, especially about kids from poverty don't always fail, kids from affluence don't always succeed. I guess my question to you is, you're doing a lot of programs. You mentioned several that you are currently doing. You mentioned intervention, which I'm not sure exactly what intervention means, but in your data and in your district, how many successes have you had? How many kids were lifted from poverty? Can you give me a hard number? That $500,000 a year. Is that what you said you get?
That would be the projection for next year. I think this year was just under 300,000. So,
okay. So what's that translate into for the people of Kansas? How many kids are raised out of poverty?
Sure, excellent question. I'll give you two metrics that I really like. The first of which is graduation rate, currently at or above 90%. The second is post-secondary success, which we're currently exceeding expectations by about 8% there. Those to me are two tangibles that the citizens of Kansas deserve.
Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a point of clarification. Definition of at-risk, is that related to poverty, or is it at risk that the student will not complete school?
I love this question. Thank you. For the purposes of school finance, as alluded to this gentleman, we use the proxy of free lunch in the state of Kansas. I believe there's 29 other states that do that same. For the purposes of intervention, we have 9 different qualifications that essentially label or indicate that a student is at risk. I'll give you a couple examples. If they have failed the previous grade level, if they come from a mother, a single parent home, if they come from a pregnant mother, et cetera. So we have the different classifications for purposes of intervention. School finance uses free lunch for purposes of this rating.
And I appreciate that. And just I guess to circle back on that, I want to be specific that the term at risk isn't necessarily a financial term, that the student will not, whether they get out of poverty or not, they're at risk of not completing their education due to poverty levels. Or is my misunderstanding of that?
I think that there's two different terms. There's the terms used for the purpose of the school finance formula, and then there's those that we use as it relates to driving.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Representative Estes.
Thank you. Could you elaborate on how you calculate post-secondary success? How are you, specifically, I was looking at that this weekend, and how are you keeping track of where students go and how long they stay in the program they're in?
Sure. We actually do not have to calculate it ourselves. Thankfully, the State Department does that. But I'll give you a couple outcomes that they believe are indicative of post-secondary success. So that would be enrolling in a post-secondary program and completing a set number of hours. You've likely heard discussion regarding enrollment in the military. It's currently not counted. I will tell you, we personally believe enrollment in the military is to be counted, but separate conversation for another day. Obviously then, receiving an industry level certification, et cetera. So those would be a couple examples for you.
Thank you.
Further questions? All right. Thank you, sir. Appreciate you making the trip.
Thank you, Chair Thomas.
All right, we're going to move on committee to our next conferee, Dr. Anna Stubblefield, Superintendent of KCK, USD 500, I believe, right?
Good afternoon, Chair Thomas and committee members. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you. I won't repeat a lot of the things that I had that Superintendent Kellen shared, and I'll speak more about the general impact of poverty, and I'll speak more to Kansas City, Kansas. So for a lot of you, you may know that Kansas City, Kansas Public Schools, we will be impacted. We would lose $7.5 million. KCKPS is the largest school district in Wyandotte County and the 5th largest school district in Kansas. We have just over 20,000 students enrolled, and 81% of our students meet one of the criteria to be defined as at risk. 57% of our students have a home language other than English. 39% of are English language learners, and 14% of our students are in special education settings. USD 500 is committed to meeting the needs of our richly diverse community, and it's still, this complex context presents our district with a significant challenge in providing at-risk programs and opportunities at scale. Just a little other context and history for you about KCKPS. I am in my just slightly over 1.5 years as the superintendent. I'm the 6th superintendent in 6 years. If you do any research around stability, around academic growth and achievement and the impact on the community, there are some research that shows that every time you change a superintendent, it impacts students negatively. It sets them back anywhere between 5 to 7 years just because of the sheer changes that can happen within a system. But I will, I stand before you to say that the KCKPS has been and continues to be committed to using the at-risk funds in targeted accounts with specific programs to meet the needs of our students. Some of the things that we have implemented this year alone is we have now implemented common assessments so that we quarterly can see the progress of our students according to the benchmarks and the state standards. We also, this semester, have seen growth in our FastBridge data that shows we're expecting some positive outcomes when on our state assessments and other measurements that we use. And we recently, our board has approved and supports us implementing a dual language program. We will start it in our elementaries, and we're started it in 3 of our elementaries with starting with just a cohort of kindergartners. I say that all to say these things have been started and implemented based off of the specific things that we have done over the years with the money that we've received. And some of those include strategic planning for teachers in critical areas based off the needs of our students, conscious discipline training, PACES, school-based crisis services, and that's addressing the mental health and the social emotional needs of our students, parent involvement. We have been very intentional about adding family and community engagement specialists so that because we know the impact of the parent and guardians that support our students. We also allocate funds to provide transportation for our McKinney-Vento students. Those are our students who are unhoused or don't have a home. To ensure that they are able to come to school. We have started to transition our in-school suspension rooms to recovery rooms and restorative places so that our students feel connected, so that they are at schools, because we know the impact of chronic absenteeism, so we need our students at school. We've also extended our Kids Zone program, and that's before and after school care for our families to ensure that the students have the academic support and a safe place to be while their parents have to work different hours. We also have instructional aides, instructional coaches, and social workers, and those are just a few. We continue to focus our strategic planning and target use of at-risk funding and the results in broader improvements across our campuses, and I'll just highlight a few. In 19-20 school year, 34 of the 48 schools were identified as KSDA targeted support improvement and or comprehensive support improvement schools. This number decreased this year. Now we are at 20 of our 49 schools, and in January, that we received that information of January of this year. Of the 20 remaining on the list, 8 schools moved to less intensive identification based off improved data. This critical work occurring over the last 3 years have helped us to be more targeted, and I shared some of the programs that we have implemented. Also last year, KSD honored 7 of KCKPS schools, including Sumner Academy of Arts and Science, Emerson Elementary School, Bertram Carruthers Elementary School, John Fisk Elementary School, Mark Twain Elementary School, Thomas A. Edison Elementary School, and Arrowhead Middle School. They all received the Challenge Award in 2021. These 7 schools were part of 100 schools in the state selected to receive this award for outstanding achievement on the 2021 math and reading assessment results. Finally, I would just like to say that we recognize, that we have some unique challenges in Kansas City, Kansas, but we are fully committed to making the necessary improvements to change the trajectory of our students in their lives. I'm committed, as the superintendent, we recognize what the stability of both leadership and finances and how that can positively impact the outcomes for our students. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. With that, we will move on to Susan Willis, Chief Financial Officer, Wichita Public Schools. Welcome to our committee.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Thomas and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comments in support of House Bill 2223. As stated, my name is Susan Willis, and I'm the Chief Financial Officer for Wichita Public Schools. So it's a little nerve-wracking after following two very accomplished superintendents, when I would prefer to be back in the office crunching more numbers. So, so bear with me, please. Wichita Public Schools proudly educates 47,500 students each year. 37,586 of those students are defined with some sort of at-risk criteria, typically more than one. That number by itself would be the second largest school district in the state of Kansas, just to give you a concept of the volume of students that we educate that have at-risk needs. That's 79% of our student population. 60% of our schools educate students that have 75% or more students with that defined at-risk criteria. If you are a classroom teacher in Wichita, the odds that out of 20 kids in a class, you are providing differentiated instruction for at least 16 or more of them, the odds are very good. 98% of our schools have 50% or more students with at-risk criteria. This extreme level of need requires many layers of supports and interventions, and Wichita uses its high-density at-risk funding to support those needs. The anticipated sunset of these funds would be a crushing blow to those students who are in much need of help and to our budget overall. This is, for Wichita, a $17 million cut. Wichita receives its at-risk funding on a formula based on the free meal population, which for Wichita is 69% of students. So we already have a funding gap between at-risk funding and our defined at-risk students. High density helps fill that gap. It is exactly the concentration and volume of students in the city of Wichita that have those needs that basically provide it is the definition of high density at risk. Those funds support many programs for Wichita, including after-school programming, mentor programming, tutoring, homework support, alternative instructional sites, intervention teachers, behavior interventionists, programs such as AVID, JAG, behavior, I mentioned behavior counselors, social workers, and other staff that work directly with those students. These funds are having an impact. If we just look at the learning center pieces alone, 5,400 students were served in one of Wichita's either comprehensive learning center sites or its alternative high school. We're covering 2,600 credits where they had fallen behind their peers. And last year, we graduated through those programs 391 students who would not have otherwise graduated, impacting our graduation rate by almost 12%. From a budgetary perspective, planning for a cut in 1, 2, 3 years is a difficult proposition. If I'm planning for my retirement, I don't start planning the day my income ends. I plan for that cut 1, 2, or 3 years ahead of time, and I start reducing my spending. It doesn't work that way with high-density at-risk because we need to provide those services, and we are getting the funds we have to spend. So I either continue those programs, and then when the sunset comes, rip the Band-Aid and cut that $17 million out of the budget, or I need to start rolling back ongoing programs and put into place more one-time programs that are easier to reduce. Not a good solution when in a district our size, it takes at least a year, if not 2, to get programs up and running. As the largest school district in Kansas, we definitely understand the responsibility we have to all of our students, but particularly to our at-risk students. We must provide many and varied supports to meet students where they're at when they come to us. That is a huge mountain to climb when you're talking over 37,500 students that our teachers and staff rally around every single day. The high-density at-risk funding is essential to that work and to help those staff climb that mountain every day. Wichita stands in strong support of House Bill 2223, and we would urge the committee to advance this bill. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. With that, I'm going to turn to WebEx. Do we have Devin Wilson, Parent Teacher Association for Kansas, online with us?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, very good. The floor is yours. Welcome.
All right, great. Yeah, thank you for having me. Chairman Thomas, members of the committee, I'm Devin Wilson, representing Kansas State PTA, Parent Teachers Association today, and we stand in support of House Bill 2223. And I'll provide my testimony for you here, and I appreciate the opportunity to provide this via WebEx without having to travel to Topeka. This is a great tool that everyone in the State House has adopted. Passage of the bill, House Bill 2223, would make permanent the general education school finance formula weighting for students in high poverty communities and schools. The bill's in alignment with our Kansas PTA legislative priorities 1, 2, and 3, and those are linked in our testimony, and you can find those on our website. Also preserving Article 6 of the Kansas Constitution, investing in public education, and fully funding education mandates. The need is great. Kansas public schools enroll nearly 200,000 students who are eligible for the free lunch program. This means that 40% of public school students are from households with incomes at or below 130% of the federal poverty level, which equates to just under $30,000 a year for a 3-person family, or $24.95 a month. Among these youth, over 14,000 are living in communities and attending schools where over a third of their peers are in the same situation. Kansas private school systems have admitted less than 4,000 students eligible for free lunch. Youth living in poverty are much less likely to enter kindergarten ready to learn, but this does not diminish our collective responsibility to provide equitable opportunities for success paid through state aid and weighted funds. Public neighborhood schools welcome all Kansas youth regardless of their needs. All youth have the right to a free public education with oversight by elected state and local board members. The Kansas PTA opposes cutting $76 million from at-risk communities, enough to hire over 1,300 teachers to better individualize instruction. All students have a right and deserve a neighborhood school in which funding matches the actual cost to provide quality educational experiences. Again, supporting this bill would align with the Gannon and Montoy agreements. High density at-risk weighting was added to the school finance formula in 2006 and expanded in 2017 to strengthen capacity within school districts and buildings, serving students living within high concentrations of poverty. Decades of economic research on school finance has documented the strong relationship between expenditures and equitable outcomes and opportunities for at-risk students to achieve college and career readiness. The Kansas Legislative Post-Office Audit Division reported that most of the districts reviewed spent more to provide at-risk services than they received in state at-risk funding. Quoting from their report, the 20 districts we reviewed received $125 million in state at-risk funding, but reported spending $162 million to provide at-risk services. Most districts served more students than they received, and that studies linked in our testimony posted on your website. The final Gannon 2019 bipartisan agreement that passed constitutional review by the state Supreme Court included at-risk weightings to ensure equitable and adequate funding regardless of a student's zip code. And now the expectation for impact under the Montoy 3-year phased-in agreement, when state general and special education funding peaked close to the constitutionally adequate levels, students' educational outcomes improved in Kansas. Under Gannon 6-year phased-in agreement, the new baseline for assessing the impact of the restored general education school funding agreement begins no sooner than this school year, the 2022-2023 school year. Prior to school year 23, districts operated with partial restoration of full funding and a 6-year wait to bring back all the needed educators and instructional supports. And in Just 1.5 years into the 6-year incremental restoration of state aid, student learning has been disrupted by the multi-year global pandemic. The impact of at-risk funding in Kansas over this time period is summarized in the KSB attachment. And summarized here, Kansas provides additional funding for at-risk students based on the number of low-income students, but used to assist any student with problems in school. The number and percentage of at-risk Kansas students has been rising on multiple measures. Despite recent increases, the actual value of at-risk funding is lower than in previous years, whether measured per pupil, by total inflation-adjusted dollars, or share of total funding. Under the current school board policies for using and approving at-risk dollars, test scores rose when real funding was increased and declined when real funding fell behind inflation. Graduation rates and adult educational attainment have increased, with Kansas ranking above the U.S. average while providing below average per pupil funding and serving an above average percentage of low-income students. And we know that return on investment results in a more robust pipeline for the Kansas economy, as well as protective factor against recession for Kansas youth. Increased educational outcomes leads to increased annual income among Kansans. Again, our references are KSB linked in our testimony. Again, Kansas Parent Teacher Association supports removing the sunset on the high density at-risk weighting in House Bill 2223. On behalf of the parents, teachers, and patrons of the Kansas PTA, we're nearly 8,500 strong this year. We urge this committee and the Kansas Legislature to uphold the both statutory formulas for funding general and special education. Together, this agreed upon plan will provide every Kansas student the opportunity for career and college readiness, regardless of zip code. Commitment to this plan includes the General Education Midwest Consumer Price Index, inflationary adjustment, and full state reimbursement for the 92% of the excess cost as noted in the special education funding formula. We ask committee members to pass out favorably this bill, House Bill 2223, removing the high density at-risk sunset. Thank you all for your time and consideration, and I'll be around for questions if you have any later.
Very good. Thank you, sir. With that, we'll turn to Jim Carlson with United School Administrators. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's great to be back. You know, I respect this committee's time, and from what's been told you today, I can't add a great deal. You know, Dr. Adams from Chanute, Dr. Stubblefield from USD 500 in Kansas City, Kansas, and Ms. Willis from USD 259 summed it up very well. And, you know, it's been mentioned earlier, but I'll restate it. A Kansas legislative post-audit found that cost to districts to educate at-risk students goes up when larger portions are in poverty. Currently, there are nearly 75% of the school districts in Kansas that receive high-density at-risk. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, because of COVID, you know, that increased poverty in Kansas. It created more of a learning loss for our students. And so, you know, I can't state any better than what's been said before. We support the intent of, you know, HB 2223 and ask the committee to look favorably upon the bill. So I'll stand for questions when you're ready. Thank you very much.
I was about to blow the whistle on you, sir, for taking too long. Thank you. With that, we will turn to our last conferee in person, Ms. Leah Fleming with KASB. Welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Kind of echoing Mr. Carlson's comments, it's kind of hard to improve on what you've already heard. Our member policies support the Kansas State Board of Education's Kansas Can vision for the success of each student to include preparation for post-secondary success. And our policies include support for at-risk funding needed to meet the needs of diverse students. So just another thing that we'll add to what you've already heard, and I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Very good. In committee, I'll point you to we have several written proponents also in your folder, from superintendents up to the state board, up to the KNEA. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions from the committee. Representative Ruiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Stubblefield, if you'd come up to the podium, please. Can you tell me approximately how many single-parent households we have that have students in USD 500? Do you have that figure in hand?
I do not have that figure in hand. If I'm going off just based off of our research, I would say it's over 50%, but I don't know, have the exact number in front of me. Sorry.
Could you arrange to get that to me, that information?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sir, further questions from the committee? Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is a question for the reviser rather than one of the proponents. So are we not constitutionally set a certain amount of money that's to be set aside to pay for schools in Kansas?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the last time the state was at the court on school finance, that's the Kansas Supreme Court, it approved the school finance formula as it then existed with the funding levels based on a plan to increase the base aid amount over a period of the next 5 years, including the school year 22-23, at which point the legislature would be satisfying its constitutional requirement to fund public education in the state of Kansas.
So a follow-up to that same question then. So there is a certain amount of money that we are funding schools, and so this extra money that we're setting aside here for at-risk students, if this did sunset, would not that amount of money be focused over the rest of the students and bringing everybody's level up as far as the all student level, student income levels or student expenses?
The court's opinion focused on total funding for public education, of which the high-density at-risk weighting was a part of that total funding considered by the court in reaching its decision that statutory structure of funding met the constitutional requirement. And therefore, it's arguable that any reduction in any portion of the statutory financing scheme under the School Finance Act could potentially open up the state to further litigation, and on the argument grounds that it is not complying with its constitutional requirement to adequately fund public schools.
Even though that the total bill would be the same, how that would be adjusted?
Okay, I apologize. I did not understand your question. If the total amount of spending were to remain the same,
Well, would go
be
up.
reallocated into different areas, the question would still remain whether or not it was adequately addressing student needs in light of the opinion of the court. I can't say for certain that the court wouldn't find the state, that funding structure to be problematic, and reducing funding directed at at-risk students. Because the court did note the poor performance in at-risk students as part of its series of opinions under the Gannon litigation. So since the court did note at-risk student performance in its opinions, there might be a question as to whether or not reducing that particular targeted funding would reopen the litigation.
So on the same hand, if the Kansas schools were not, even though we're funding at-risk students and we're not getting the levels of education and to the levels that we want for those kids to graduate and be good citizens, then are they going to come back at the legislature possibly because we're not, through the schools, we're not providing a good enough education for at-risk students? I mean, how does the, I realize that you're just trying to figure out what the Supreme Court's saying, but are they going to really look at it and say, well, you still haven't, the schools are not getting these at-risk students up to the level that we need?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, these are hypotheticals that require speculation as to both what the plaintiffs in the litigation might do in reaction to the hypothetical legislation, and then speculation as to what the court might rule. At this time, I do not have sufficient information or knowledge to speculate anywhere close to accurately on what might happen in those proposed scenarios. I apologize.
Okay.
Further questions? Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Willis, and then Dr. Stubblefield. Thank you for your testimony, and just curious, on page 2 of your testimony, point of clarification, you state that without the funds, you estimate a minimum impact on your graduation rate to be over 12%. Is that for all students or just for the alternative programs that the students in the alternative program?
That would be for all students. So without those almost 400 at-risk students graduating, we would have anticipated our enrollment being far less than it was.
Okay, thank you very much. And Dr. Stubblefield? And you may have said this in your testimony, and if you did, please forgive, but in light of the 12% impact of Wichita Public Schools, how do you feel your graduation rates will be impacted if these funds are not, if the funds are sunset?
Currently, the funds support our alternative school setting, and we have about 75 kids there, and it also supports our, we have a Project Reach for students. I don't know the exact percent, but I would say anywhere between around 10, it would impact our graduation, probably around 10%.
So you would agree like 10
Yeah.
to 12% is a good ballpark for both?
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much.
Representative Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for Ms. Willis from Wichita. Is Wichita School District supportive of the Gannon decision?
I think the Wichita School District, like all districts in Kansas, support a finance formula that is student-driven, that is consistent, and that is funded.
As we're talking about this today, and as we've been talking about it throughout the session, the Gannon decision really draws a regression line. It says if we fund at this level, we will see performance at this level. And do you see that in the Wichita School District as we've gone through now 6 years of the Gannon decision?
So I think we have made progress as far as our at-risk students are concerned. Certainly, a lot of the programs that we described are getting kids to walk across the stage. Now, if you look at other measurements, say like the state assessment, you're not seeing that growth coming out from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3. But what you don't see is that student may have gone from 1.1 to 1.4, because in the summary information that is published, it's still a 1. So I think we are making progress. We have a lot of work. This is a lot of kids that need help, and it's tough sledding. It's very tough sledding, and they're 37,500 kids with 37,500 needs. So it's very individualized with what they need, and it's difficult to staff. It's difficult to find enough bus drivers to get kids to school. So we have a lot of barriers outside of the funding piece that we have to battle. But I think we are making progress. We have a lot of work still yet to do.
When did you start getting high density at risk?
The formula that came into play that we're currently under was 2017-18. That's when funds started coming back into the school system.
You didn't have any before 2017?
We had 2 years under the block grant, and then before that, we had a different funding mechanism. That was a little before my time, so.
Well, I think there was high risk.
Oh, yeah, I mean, Mr. Brady mentioned that high density at risk has actually been part of the entire formula since 2004. So we've had funds coming in But then other funds were being cut along the way too. 2008 to 2016, we definitely struggled with funding.
Okay, so let's just go back to 2017. And, you know, you talk about things that are a little esoteric for me. From 2017 till current, which we're now 2023, what are solid numbers I can look at and say, like Gannon's trying to say, that there's a solid regression line here?
I think in Wichita, you would look at our graduation rates. We are at over 80%. That was the goal we set for ourselves back in 2017-18 as part of our strategic plan. So I think that is probably the biggest accomplishment we can point to where funds made a difference. Some of the screener data I think we can look at and say we've had success in pockets, but really graduation rate is probably our strongest data point.
So in 2022, which would be your last graduation, you had 80%.
Over 80%.
Of high-risk kids.
All of all students. So.
I was talking about the at-risk funding.
Oh, specifically students of that, again, you could probably take 80% of the 80% and get there, but we look at just graduation rate as a whole. But if you needed something specific for at-risk students, we could provide that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're kind of talking about, the at-risk money here, so.
Right. We definitely made improvement when 80% of those kids would have most likely had an at-risk factor.
And back in 2017, what percentage?
We were 70 and change.
70%, so you've gone.
Oh, we've done, yes,
Yeah, about
significantly.
10% increase. And one last question, I've kind of taken up some time here, but one last question. When you're a financial officer,
Yes.
so when you get the weighting for at-risk, that money is kept in a separate account and used only for
Yes.
at-risk funding, is
Yes.
that correct?
And we know, as we're the largest district, we are scrutinized like
Sure.
no other, right? And we are always picked for audit. So we are very, very cognizant that people will look at what we're spending our at-risk dollars on. We follow the evidence-based practice model that KSD puts out, and we make sure that every dollar that we spend out of at-risk is on that evidence-based list.
Okay, and the evidence is your graduation rate. Are there other evidence that?
Sure, we look at interim screeners, so we use FastBridge as well. So we're looking at how students do in the fall, and then the winter, and then the spring, if we make progress. We have had summer school these past few summers that is being paid for partly with at-risk, partly with federal dollars. So we're looking at how those students performed in the summer and how that carries over to the fall. Again, we are looking at assessment data. Do we have some growth, even if we're not getting kids to the 2 or the 3 where we'd like them to be? So we're looking at all of that data.
Okay. Does the state require you to keep funding separate on at-risk?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions from the committee? Representative Estes.
Mrs. Willis, I'm sorry, didn't let you get away. On page 2 of your testimony, you said that $400,000 was used, I'm sorry, for the summer school expansion. How many students were in the district were getting summer school prior to the expansion, and how many got it because of the expansion?
So we had a very limited summer school program through 19. Like a few hundred. Primarily, the high school program was our focus, to try to give those students an opportunity to get some credit recovery. We had some programs that we were using at-risk dollars for that purpose. At-risk dollars in combination with federal COVID relief, we expanded summer school significantly, and we served, I believe it was 8,000 students over the summer. I'd have to double check my records to make sure that's accurate, so.
So you guys have gone from, did I understand?
Hundreds to thousands.
Hundreds to thousands.
Now, will we be able to maintain quite that level post-COVID relief money? It will most likely have to condense, but we've now seen, again, especially expanding some of the high school programming options, we've had great results with our high school students and summer learning. We even do an extended learning opportunity at the end of each semester where students have are failing their classes. We give them an opportunity to get those Fs to a C or a D, and that's been very successful as well.
So certainly when it comes to setting the priorities, I was really struck by the amount you guys had in credit recovery. And it's to me, it's more like you guys can't afford not to pick funding this over something else.
I think that's exactly right. If you look at what we would have to do if the funding, that $17 million goes away, and particularly in light of the fact that the timeline would be the same as the end of essentially the federal relief funding, we would have to make some terrifically hard choices on what programs stay and what gets cut. And we understand that those programs that get cut may be programs that are very successful, but they may be serving small populations like foster care students. So that's only 700 students for us, still a large number, but again, compared to a program that may serve 8,000 ESOL students, you have to make those hard choices.
Another, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. In that 1.7 million that's going for tutorial assistance, are you guys measuring GPAs or how many classes these kids were failing before? And do you have a result for afterwards? And if you do, could I please get a copy of that?
I can get you some results.
Thank you.
Real quick, and then we'll move on. So you guys, this would be a $17.6 million cut, you said, right?
Yeah, this year we're at 16.5. We would anticipate in '24 that to grow a little bit.
Okay. Do you know how much of the ESSER funds, I think you guys got just over 200 million. Did you guys use that, since it's predominantly for reimbursement, to basically fill in some of those gaps and reimburse for these costs? Like, do you know how much you use specifically for at-risk?
Well, the predominant amount of ESSER funding was specific to learning loss, and who suffered the learning loss the most were at-risk students. So I can think of several programs. We have an accelerated academy that actually went out kind of in that post-COVID environment, seeking students who dropped out during that time. And that program started with 7 kids. It's now at 215. Can we maintain that post-ESSER? I don't know exactly how we'll do that, but it's those type of programs that are targeting those high needs populations that once that federal relief money is gone, we're going to make tough choices. It won't be a pleasant.
And do you think that sort of helped contribute to the increase in graduation rates over the past couple of years?
Sure. I mean, you put 200 million and change into a system, you're going to get some outcomes, right? But I think it was probably the ability to perhaps take those core programs that we had added with our high density and regular at-risk and basically grow those a little bit faster than we might otherwise. And knowing that there were so many gaps with those kids coming back into school and so many behavior needs. That's actually one of the bigger areas we have a lot of concern about. Is we've added a lot of counselors, a lot of social workers, some school psychologists, and everyone wants to keep them. And how are we going to do that? So,
Very good. Thank you, Representative Donahoe, and then Representative Featherston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason, this is for you. And did the Gannon ruling dictate outcomes in any way? The reason I asked the question is the representative made the statement, you pay for this and you get this. But Gannon never necessitated any outcomes, correct? Just the funding, or maybe I'm incorrect.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the Gannon decision did not specify any particular outcomes that school districts, either individually or as a whole, had to satisfy as a result of any increase in funding. It did look at some outputs from the educational system during the years when the plaintiffs had alleged there was insufficient or unconstitutional levels of funding. Courts did look at those outputs from the school districts for those years, but no, it did not specify any particular outcomes from the increase in funding.
Another question. Also, we talked about the high density being sunsetted and the loss of the money. The Gannon decision really was talking about the total amount of money that was provided, correct? Not just this at risk or whatever, but it was based upon what they agreed was X amount of money was needed to provide for the needs of the student to get a quality education, correct?
Mr. Chairman, the Gannon decision was based on analysis of the total funding going to public education. I would just note, as I had to an earlier question, that the court did look at particular categories of students who had been shown to be underperforming in that analysis of the outputs for the unconstitutional funding, and at-risk students were one of those categories of students the court identified as having underperformed in terms of outputs during the unconstitutional funding years. And so the court did take note of at-risk students, although it did not specify particular levels of funding for at-risk students in its order.
But my point is being, if this sunsets and that money goes away, there's definitely going to be a lawsuit or some action, because it was the court ruling that this amount of money had to be expended, correct? Or that's what the agreement, they agreed on that amount of money to be spent.
Mr. Chairman, I just can't speculate as to what the plaintiffs in the Gannon lawsuit or any other potential plaintiffs might or might not do if the at-risk funding is sunsetted in 2024.
My real question is, the agreement was based upon getting the total amount of money that they all agreed to was necessary to provide the education, correct?
The court held that the finance formula as it was in law with the set increases in the base state aid over the next 5 years did bring the level of funding, total level of funding for school districts up to a constitutionally adequate level. That was what the court held.
And my final point being is that we certainly have to provide this money. I mean, that was the agreement. So if this sunsets or whatever, there has to be a mechanism to provide that same amount of money. It just can't go away, or we seem to open ourselves to a lawsuit. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good, Representative Featherston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had two things come to mind as I listened that seemed like logical conclusions, but you know, logic in this building. So if somebody could just confirm or deny that I've gone the wrong way. It seems to me if we have at-risk kids served with more programs, that frees up teacher time and school resources to help non-at-risk students more, thus all students are benefiting from at-risk funding. And then my number two conclusion is that if we have before and after school programs, especially for at-risk kids, that would be a workforce enhancement because their parents would know their kids were in a safe environment and thus they would be able to go to work more readily. Does that seem logical?
From my perspective and experience, yes. To the latter about the programs for childcare, we are able to provide a safe place for students before and after school. And as far as having the additional support and interventions, it's, if any of you know teachers or work with teachers, the more supports and staff and people that you have. Some kids need one-on-one, some kids need small group, and if those supports are not in place, all of those students would be in the same place at the same time, possibly with one teacher, which could cause challenges for multiple students.
Representative Younger.
Just because I want to commend you guys because in your testimony that 2019-2020 school year, you had 34 of 48 schools were identified as target. And then I think there was this thing called the pandemic that happened, and you guys, in January of 2023, you were down to
20.
20. I mean, that's amazing. I don't know if people really in this room understand, a large urban district, what that takes for your team and your teachers to accomplish that. I mean, I think we should be standing up and celebrating you guys, because that's absolutely amazing. So I just wanted to get that out there for you, because it is. And I'd like to know if Wichita was the same way, the same kind of result. So again, I just want to commend you, because I think that's fantastic.
Thank you.
Dare I say, I'm sorry.
Dare.
Dare I say, that probably wouldn't have been possible without that at-risk funding. So.
Very good. I have a quick question, and I think, Mr. Brady, if you don't mind, we talked about if this does expire, and I hadn't heard it mentioned yet unless I just missed it, and I apologize, 2027. We get rid of this sunset. Does this expire in 27? Does the formula get revisited in 27? Talk to me about 2027, because I feel like there was a conversation where we talked about if the sunset goes away, the formula has to be redone in 27 anyway.
It's our understanding the entire formula expires after fiscal 27. They did that at the same time. They did that at the same time that they then put a earlier sunset on high density at risk. So that's the reason why we chose to just eliminate the sunset, and then it was our understanding that it would just comply with the challenge the legislature is going to have after 27, which is dealing with either renewing that whole formula or change it or whatever it's done at that point in time. So.
Okay, so to be clear, if we eliminate the sunset, I believe there was language about how it pretty much goes away until the legislature says so, but I want to be clear, it goes away in 27 if we don't act. Would that be?
That's the explanation I got from KSDE.
Okay. Jason?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that is correct. There is a overall expiration for the Kansas School Equity Enhancement Act of July 1st, 2027.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear on that, so that way when it says, it goes until the legislature takes action, I want to make sure that that would be 2027, not just indefinitely. So I wanted to make that point.
Chair, that's why I call this affectionately the School Finance Conformity Bill, because this would conform this one weighting with the remainder of the formula in terms of when it.
Well, there may be a potential amendment to rename the whole bill. If you would prefer, you let me know. Further questions from the conference. Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm not sure who best to answer this, but I do see Craig in the room, so maybe Craig can answer this. I'm just curious, on the bill, page 2, lines 21 through 24. It states that if a school district does not spend such money on such best practices for 3 consecutive years, the school district shall not qualify to receive the high-density at-risk student weighting. Has any school district not used the funds appropriately? Has it been effectively used, or is there school districts that no more funds for you?
To date, all the school districts have used the funds appropriately, using what you heard the superintendent's reference earlier, the evidence-based at-risk best practices.
Okay, thank you, Craig.
Hello, Craig, by the way, welcome. It's good to see you again. Further questions from the committee? Very good. Seeing none, we will close the proponent testimony. There are no neutral, no opponents to this, so we're not even going to bother opening that part of the hearing. We will consider that closed. Committee, we have 2 potential bills left to work tomorrow. That would be the Safe and Secure Schools bill we'd originally discussed, and then potentially this bill. So if you have ideas or amendments for either one of those bills, please try to get them in quickly. Let me know if there are any. Other than that, that pretty much concludes our business before turnaround. So with that, committee,